Good evening, my friend. Before we begin this journey into the past, I want to invite you to subscribe to our channel. Here, you'll find many more long and gentle stories that help you let go of your worries, drift into history, and fall asleep to the quiet voice of old tales. So settle in, close your eyes, allow yourself to rest, and listen. My name is Yaakov. Long ago, I was known as a merchant who traveled the Great Silk Road. Today I am an old man. My hands are weary from the road. My legs can no longer endure long journeys, and my voice carries only the quiet whisper of past times. Yet in my memory the roads still live, stretching from the caravanserais of Central Asia to the bustling markets of Syria, from the desert paths of Samarkand to the harbors of the Mediterranean Sea. I have seen cities that glitter with gold, and villages where people shared their last piece of bread. I traded in silk, spices, horses, and paper. But most of all, I traded in stories. For every journey, every encounter left its mark on me. Now, as night settles in my home, I find comfort in recalling those distant days. And tonight, I wish to tell you the story of my life upon the great road that bound east and west together. I was born in a small town not far from Horazm. My childhood was not wealthy, yet it was filled with the scent of spices brought to the bazaar by caravans, and the noise of merchants arguing over prices. From an early age, I watched as people traded silk for horses, as merchants brought glassware from distant lands, as stalls filled with strange nuts and dried fruits I had never seen before. It was then I realized the world was far greater than our town, and that the road opened doors to countless riches and new knowledge. When I was only 17, I joined a caravan for the first time. My father gave me a few rolls of cotton cloth, a small bundle of dried dates, and his advice: never rush, listen to your elders, and remember that the road does not forgive carelessness. I walked beside the camels, their heavy steps sinking into the sand, and my heart beat faster than the drums the caravan men use to keep rhythm. We crossed dry steppes and slept in the shade of caravanserais, whose walls still remembered travelers from centuries past. I remember my first day in Samarkand. The city struck me with its grandeur. The blue domes of the mosques gleamed in the sun, and the market roared so loudly it seemed as if the whole world had gathered there. I saw Indian traders selling pepper and cinnamon, Chinese envoys trading silk and porcelain, and Arab scholars offering books written in fine script. I felt like a small grain of sand in that vast sea, yet at the same time I understood I had become part of the great road. The first years were the hardest. I often felt ill along the way, froze in the mountains while crossing passes, and burned under the merciless desert sun. I learned to taste the difference between Indian pepper and Syrian pepper, to judge the weight of goods by sight, to sense the worth of a coin before holding it in my hand. And above all, I learned to listen to people, for trade is not only about goods, it is about trust. A person gives you their silver or gold only when they believe in your word. Once, in my youth, I accompanied a small shipment of silk to Bokhara. We traveled for weeks, along roads fraught with danger, bandits lurking near oases, and storms that could bury an entire caravan in the sands. I remember one night when the wind rose so fiercely we could not even see the torches ahead. We wrapped ourselves in cloaks, pressed against the camels, so as not to be lost. And when the storm finally calmed, we emerged to see a sky filled with stars, closer than I had ever known them. Then the elder caravan master said to me, "The road will always test you, but if you endure, it will open the world before you." Those words have stayed with me ever since. As the years passed, I grew stronger. I was no longer the boy who marveled at every stall. I began to keep my own accounts, negotiate trades, exchange cloth for spices, and spices for horses. I came to understand that a merchant's true wealth is not a chest of coins, but the ability to always find a new road when the old one is closed. And yet, It was not the deals that remained most vivid in my memory, but the people. The old craftsman who gave me a clay cup, saying, "May it be your keepsake." The Syrian boy who had never seen snow, but dreamed of reaching the north. The wandering physician who healed with herbs and taught us to tell a useful root from a poisonous one. They were all part of the road, and each left a mark on my life. I remember the moment when I first truly felt like a merchant. It was in Kashgar, a city standing at the crossroads, breathing in the spirit of both East and West. The caravan I traveled had been on the road for a long time. We had crossed deserts, passed through mountains where the wind nearly stripped us of our strength, and when at last we reached the city, my heart beat like that of a bird released from its cage. The Kashgar market was like a world of its own. Row upon row stretched endlessly, each overflowing with noise, color, and scent. In the air mingled the fragrance of cinnamon and cloves with the smell of camel hair, smoke, and freshly baked bread. Stalls displayed rolls of Chinese silk, Persian carpets, blades of Damascus steel, and barrels of grape wine. People spoke in many tongues, and the chorus of their voices rose into an unusual melody of the road. I carried only a small load, just a few rolls of fine cotton from my homeland. For others it was nothing, but for me it was everything I had. I stood, hesitating, studying the traders, too unsure to take the first step. They all seemed more seasoned, louder, shrewder than me. Then an old man approached, dressed in a simple robe, his beard gray with age. He touched the fabric and said, "This cotton is good. Soft, light, with an even thread. You're new here, aren't you?" I nodded. He led me to the spice row, where an Indian merchant stood, his dark eyes steady, his hands carrying the fragrance of turmeric. The old man introduced me. "Here is a young man with fine goods. He may not yet know the road, but his cloth is worth your attention." And there I made my first real trade. I exchanged my cotton rolls for several boxes of pepper and cinnamon. For some it was a small matter, but for me it was an entire world. I held those spice boxes, breathed in their scent, and felt that I now belonged to the great road. That evening we sat in the caravanserai. I lit a small oil lamp and gazed at the spices lying before me. It was not gold, not silver, yet its worth was far greater. For now I could carry them farther, trade them for something else, and each deal would expand my possibilities. It was a wheel always turning. Cloth for spices, spices for horses, horses for coins, coins are yet another load. From that moment I understood. A merchant is not the one with full chests, but the one who can turn his goods into new value again and again. And I realized something more. The road is always about people. Without them, trade is lifeless. Every market is a conversation, every bargain a matter of trust. I remember another great meeting that same year. In Samarkand, I came across a caravan of Chinese merchants. They carried silk so fine and light it seemed to float in the air when unrolled. I could not afford much, but I risked nearly everything I had and bought a few small pieces. Some of my companions thought it foolish. Silk was fragile, and a hard journey could ruin it. But inside me there was a certainty. I felt the silk would open new doors. And indeed, when we reached Bokhara, the silk sold instantly. I earned several times more than I had paid. That was the first time I tasted not just fortune, but the reward of risk well taken. From then on, I remembered always the road rewards the bold. And so, step by step, trade by trade, I was no longer the boy who timidly looked at the stalls. I became a merchant, recognized in caravanserais, known by name. My treasures were not always vast, but inside me grew a new strength, the confidence of one who walks his own road. I remember those crossings through mountains and deserts more vividly than any trade I ever made, for it was there, among winds and sands, that a man truly saw the face of the road. When we set out from Samarkand toward Kashgar, high passes awaited us. The camels breathed heavily on the climbs, their hooves slipping on stone, while snow and ice sometimes blocked the path. We moved slowly, step by step, every sound echoing against the mountains. The cold was so bitter that the water in our skins froze, and my fingers would no longer obey me. I wrapped myself in my old cloak, thinking my strength would soon give out. Yet there was always someone beside me who would share the last piece of dried meat or a gulp of warm water. That was how we endured. Together, at night we built small fires. Firewood had to be carried with us, for in the mountains there was almost none to be found. We sat close to the flames, listening to the wind howl between the rocks, waiting for dawn. And when the sun finally rose, its light struck the snow, and the mountains shone as though they were clothed in gold. In those moments, I forgot my weariness. But what left the deepest mark on me was the desert. It was nothing like the mountains. In the highlands, you battled cold and stone. In the sands, you fought against the very air itself. There were no sounds, save for the wind's breath and the steady steps of the caravan. Sand crept into our shoes, our mouths, every fold of clothing. By day the sun scorched so fiercely that the earth seemed to smoke with heat, while at night the cold gripped the body with iron hands. Once we were caught in a sandstorm. The sky darkened suddenly, and the wind raised columns of sand that blotted out everything around us. We tied the camels together so none would be lost, and wrapped our faces in cloth. The sand struck our skin like 1,000 needles. I remember walking hunched forward, unable to see anyone, clinging to the rope that connected me to another merchant. We walked like that for hours until the storm passed. When it was finally over, our caravan looked as though it had been buried in ash. Every one of us covered in dust, but every one of us alive. In the desert, we often stopped at oases. They seemed like miracles. Green palms, clear water, fresh grass. People and animals alike fell to their knees and drank as if tasting water for the first time. And there, by the oases, caravans always gathered. We met merchants from China, from India, from the Arab lands. I remember sitting under a palm tree, listening to tales of seas I had never seen, of jungles where spices grew on every branch, of cities that glowed with light even at night. Yet, danger came not only from nature. The roads were never free of bandits. They struck suddenly, especially where desert met steppe. That is why we always traveled in large groups. At times we hired guards, horsemen who knew the trails and knew how to fight. I once watched them beat back an attack. A short clash, shouts, the whistle of arrows, and then silence again. We lost a few animals and some goods, but we kept our lives. From that day, I never forgot, the road does not forgive solitude. And still, it was these crossings that made me stronger. In places where there is nothing but sand and wind, you learn to treasure the smallest things. A swallow of water, a warm cloak, the shade of a tree. Perhaps it was there that I first understood that true wealth is not in the goods we carry, but in the hardships we endure together. Now, as I sit in my home and gaze at the night sky, I often recall those crossings, for it was there in mountains and deserts that I felt closest to the very essence of life. I remember well how, after long weeks across the steppes and deserts, our caravan would finally reach the great cities. Each had its own scent, its own color, its own music, and each was so different from the last that it felt as though one stepped from one world into an entirely new one. When we first arrived in Bokhara, I was struck by the clamor of the market. It began before dawn, when the air was still cool and carried the smell of freshly baked bread. Merchants laid out their wares, and within an hour you could not take a step without hearing dozens of voices at once. Traders from India shouted the prices of spices. Persian craftsmen unrolled carpets patterned like starry skies, and Arab sellers held up tiny flasks of perfumes so strong they made your head swim. In my hands I carried only modest goods, rolls of silk, and a few boxes of spices. Compared to what others sold, it was little, yet it was enough to strike my first serious bargains. My heart pounded each time I began a trade, but every time I succeeded, I gained not only coins but experience. What impressed me most was meeting Chinese merchants. They sat behind a long stall, displaying rolls of paper, which was still a novelty for many. Its smoothness, its lightness, the way it held ink, this was something new to our lands, where we relied more on parchment. I bought several rolls, and later discovered just how wise that purchase had been. Paper sold quickly, especially to those who work with books. It was in those days that I first realized knowledge in words, too, could become a form of trade. And then there was Aleppo, a city to the west, reached only by a few. There I saw a commerce unlike anywhere else. Iron and copper, wines from the Mediterranean, olive oil, glass that gleamed in the sunlight as if it were gemstones. As I walked the streets, the air carried a mixture of scents: spices, grapes, fresh meat, and the smoke of clay ovens. In palaces I saw splendor that seemed beyond reach: silk curtains, silver cups, carpets covering entire halls. Yet what moved me most was not the wealth, but the books. In cities that prized knowledge, libraries were true treasures. I heard scholars debate the movements of the stars, and physicians discuss the powers of herbs, and in those moments I understood. The world was far greater than any market. In every city, I felt the road opening yet another page. I did not need to see every country, only to sit in a bazaar and listen, for the whole world gathered there: words, goods, stories. And I knew that every new meeting, every bargain, left a mark within me that I would carry through the years. And now, when I recall those cities, they rise in my memory slowly like visions. And I realize the true wealth I gained was not in my purse, but in the memory of all I saw and all I heard. I recall an event that still stands before me as clearly as if it happened yesterday. It was in the Karakum Desert, when our caravan was traveling from Kiva toward Merv. We were 20 men, 50 camels, a few donkeys, and 2 mounted guards. The day was scorching, the sky trembling with heat, and even the wind felt hot, like the breath of furnace. We kept a steady pace until a thin gray line appeared on the horizon. At first, we thought it was dust from another caravan, but our elder, Ollie, shook his head and said, "That is no caravan. That is a storm." And indeed, within an hour the wind struck us. It drove the sand so fiercely that we could not see our own hands. Men shouted, camels bellowed, and tried to break free of their ropes. We tied them into long chains so none would be lost. I wrapped my face in cloth, but the sand forced its way into my mouth and eyes all the same. I remember walking, one hand clutching the rope, thinking only of one thing: not to fall, not to be left behind. We wandered in the sands the entire night. The stars vanished, and even the shadow of the moon was gone. When at last the wind calmed, we realized we had lost our way. Ollie fell to his knees, digging through the sand with his hands, searching for one of the marker posts travelers left behind. But there was nothing. We stood in the desert as if in the middle of the sea, with no idea where to go. Then one of our guards climbed a dune. He stared into the distance for a long time before raising his arm. "Smoke," he said. We all lifted our heads and saw a thin column rising on the horizon. We set out toward it, hoping it was nomads, or perhaps another caravan. As we drew near, we found a small Bedouin camp. They welcomed us without questions, gave us water, let us sit by their fire. I sat there with a cup of warm milk in my hands, unable to believe that only hours earlier we had been so close to death. One of the Bedouins, an old man with deep wrinkles, smiled at me and said, "In the desert, survival does not belong to the one with the most water, but to the one with the most patience." Those words have stayed with me all my life. The next day, they showed us the road to Merv. Had it not been for that smoke, for that fire, we might have remained in the sand forever, and no one would have ever heard our story. I often spent the night in caravanserais, those vast stone courtyards with thick walls, filled with the smell of camel sweat, smoke, and the spice-laden stew simmering in copper cauldrons. People from every corner of the world gathered there, merchants, travelers, guards, even pilgrims. Yet outside those walls, there were always others who lived a different kind of life. I remember one night in Samarkand. We had just arrived after a long trek across the steppe, and everyone was exhausted. As I sat by the fire, women approached our caravan. They wore bright dresses, heavy ornaments in their hair, and laughed loudly, almost defiantly. They did not trade in cloth or horses, but they too had their price. I watched as young merchants quickly handed over coins to spend the night, not on hard rugs in a courtyard, but in a room with a woman's warmth. I was still too young then, too shy, and had little money. I sat apart, only listening to their voices rising to the narrow doors of the rooms upstairs. There was so much laughter and song, it was as if the city itself never knew fatigue. And I thought, each traveler seeks something different on the road. One seeks a profitable deal, another seeks knowledge, and someone else, forgetfulness, if only for a few hours. Years later, when I had gained both experience and wealth, I too entered such quarters, and there I saw not only diversions, but lives. The women told me their stories. Some had been sold in childhood, some driven by hunger, and some had chosen this path themselves, for the road left them no other. I remember one woman, in Aleppo. Her gaze was deep, sorrowful, and she spoke more languages than many merchants I knew. She laughed and sang for her guests. But when we were alone, she said to me, "You see in me an amusement, but I see in you a wanderer. We both sell our lives, you, step by step on the road, and I, with my body." Her words cut me deeper than the coldest desert night. And when I left the city, I carried with me the thought that not all choose their fate, but each struggles to survive in their own way. I will tell you a story that remains in my memory as vividly as if it happened yesterday. It took place in Bokhara, in the very heart of the bustling market. That day I carried valuable goods, several rolls of Chinese silk, and small boxes of cinnamon and cloves. For me, it was a treasure, for I had invested nearly all my coins in it. I laid the fabrics on the stall, unrolled one, and it shimmered in the sunlight like a river. People stopped to touch it, to ask the price, and then a man approached, tall, dressed in a dark robe, with eyes that seemed not to look at the cloth, but cut straight into me. "How much do you want for this silk?" he asked. I gave him a fair price, the kind we merchants usually agreed upon in honest trade. But he sneered and suddenly shouted, "This young man deceives you. He tries to sell cheap fabric at the price of gold." His voice immediately drew the crowd. People gathered, whispering among themselves. In those days, a merchant's honor was everything. If people lost faith in you, you lost not only your goods, but your reputation. My heart pounded hard in my chest. I unrolled the silk to its full length, ran my fingers along its threads, and said firmly, "This silk comes from China. It is thinner than paper, yet stronger than cotton. Look for yourselves." I handed the fabric to an older merchant nearby. He lifted it toward the light, pressed it to his lips, and nodded. "This is true Chinese silk," he declared. But the man in the dark robe would not relent. He suddenly grabbed the roll and tried to tear it from me. I clung to it with both hands, and we nearly fell together. The crowd roared. Then I saw him reaching with his other hand for the knife at his belt. In that moment, everything inside me froze. I knew if he drew it, I might not live to see the evening. But just then our guards forced their way into the crowd. One drew his saber and stepped between us. People shouted, pushing and scattering. Someone called for the city watch. When the guards arrived, they seized a man. It turned out he had long preyed upon the markets, disrupting trades, then robbing merchants at night who were left without protection. They released me, but I gathered my goods back into trembling hands. That night I could not sleep. I stared at the roll of silk and thought. In a single instant, everything could have ended. The road had taught me patience. But that day it reminded me of something more. A merchant must be not only a trader, but a defender of his own word. For wherever there is wealth, there is envy and danger. From that time on, I always hired guards. Even when I went to market in a city I knew well. And I never forgot that look, cold, dark, fixed not on my wares, but on me. I remember an event that became not only a profitable trade, but a true turning point in my life. It happened in Aleppo, a city where goods from every corner of the world converged, from Chinese porcelain to Spanish wines. The bazaar there was like an ocean, where everyone struggled to stay afloat, and only the boldest knew how to rise above the waves. That time I carried a load from Samarkand, fine carpets, several boxes of saffron, worth more than gold, and a small bundle of paper. Most merchants rushed to sell spices, knowing they would be taken instantly, but I chose differently. I placed the paper at the forefront. I unrolled a few sheets and showed them to the scribes sitting in the shade near the gates. They touched the smooth surface, exchanged glances, and one of them said, "Ink clings to this better than the parchment. Words written here will outlive us all." That phrase spread through the market faster than any rumor. Soon wealthy men gathered around me, merchants who needed to record their accounts, scholars searching for new material for books, even members of noble families. They argued. They offered coins and jewels, each eager to take just a few rolls into their hands. I sold the paper for a price several times higher than what I had paid in China. I kept the spices and carpets for the following day. When I left the market, my purse was heavy, but even heavier was the respect I felt in the eyes of other merchants. That evening, in the caravanserai, an elder trader from Bokhara approached me. He studied me for a long moment, then said, "You acted as a true merchant does. You did not chase the crowd, but found what others fail to see." His words were worth more to me than gold, for it was then I understood a deal is not simply the exchange of goods. It is the art of seeing in things what others cannot. From that time on, I was recognized in Aleppo. People would say, "That is the man who sold Chinese paper." For a young merchant, that was an honor indeed, for reputation often traveled ahead of you faster than any caravan, and that very trade allowed me to broaden my journeys. For the first time, I had enough wealth to hire my own guards, to buy stronger camels, and to carry more goods. The road, which once weighed upon me heavily, suddenly stretched wider before me. And now, when I recall that day, I see not only the coins that glittered in my chest, I see the faces of the scribes, gently stroking the sheets of paper as if they were marvels. And I think to myself, true value is not always found in gold or silver. Sometimes it lies in a thin white scroll, where words can live longer than the merchant who sold it. I remember the crossing of the Pamirs, those towering mountains where even the air itself feels foreign. We walked for weeks, and each day was a trial. Snow crunched beneath our feet, while the wind carried sharp ice that stung our faces. The camels moved slowly, breathing heavily. Some of the caravan men joked that here the gods themselves tested travelers to see if they were worthy to pass. One day the road led us into a narrow gorge. The cliffs rose so high that the sun touched the ground for only a fleeting moment. We walked close together, step by step, when suddenly a stone fell from above. It struck the ground so near that dust covered our animals. We froze. Then, all at once, a full rock slide thundered down. Shouts, the roar of camels, the crash of falling stones. I grabbed a lead rope, struggling to hold on to a panicked animal. Men scattered in all directions. The rock slide lasted only minutes, but to us it felt like an eternity when it ended. The path ahead lay buried under boulders. We stood there, unsure what to do. To go around the gorge would mean losing weeks of travel. Some urged us to turn back. But then the elder among us, a caravan man named Ahmad, said, "The road always gives a way forward. We must find it here." We began to clear the blockage with our bare hands, heaving stones one by one. Our fingers bled, but we worked until nightfall. That evening we lit a small fire for warmth, and I sat staring into the flames. Fear gripped me. For the first time, I thought we might remain in those mountains forever. But the next day, a miracle came. One of our guides discovered a narrow trail higher up, hidden behind rocks. We unloaded part of the camel's burden so they could squeeze through, and step by careful step, as if walking along a thread, we crossed a gorge. Beneath us yawned a chasm, and the wind clawed at us as though to drag us down, but we pressed forward in silence, the only sound a ringing of the camel's harness bells. When at last we reached the open plain, the sun shone bright, and the mountain behind us seemed like fading dreams. Then Ahmad said, "The road always takes its share, but if you endure, it gives back even more." In that moment I understood, a caravan is not only about goods, it is about people who become brothers, because they share danger with you. I remember Kashgar well. That city was always like a knot where the roads of east and west entwined. There you could meet anyone, a Chinese official in silk robes, an Indian spice trader, a Persian craftsman with silver jewelry, or an Arab scholar carrying a heavy book beneath his arm. We arrived there in spring. The caravan had traveled long and hard, and we were weary, but the city welcomed us as though it had been waiting. The streets were strung with banners. Musicians played in the square. Drums beat like the very heart of the city, and children ran with flowers in their hands. Someone said that day marked the beginning of the great festival of spring. I left my goods at the caravanserai and went to see the celebration. In the narrow streets, the air was thick with the smell of roasted meat and fresh flatbread. People sat on the ground, eating, laughing, singing. I saw jugglers tossing clay pots high into the air, dancers in brightly colored garments moving so lightly it seemed their feet never touched the earth. By the main square, I came upon a circle of merchants arguing over the price of spices. They spoke in different tongues, and at first it was only noise. But soon I realized each found his way to understanding. One gestured with his hands, another drew numbers in the sand, a third laid coins before him. And suddenly it was clear to me. Trade is a language understood by all, even when the words themselves are different. That evening, hundreds of fires were lit in the square. People sat in a great circle, singing and striking their drums. I sat a little apart, listening, and felt the music resonate within me, forcing my heart to beat in unison with the crowd. An old man in simple clothes sat down beside me. He handed me a cup of wine and said, "Traveler, tonight you are our guest. Drink to the spring, for it comes even to the heart of one who has walked the desert long." I took the cup and drank. The wine was bitter, yet warm like the sun itself. And I thought then that not only gold or silk gave the road its worth. There were other treasures too. An evening by the fire, the laughter of strangers who become friends, and the feeling that you belong to a world greater than any one city. That night remained with me for the rest of my life, for it showed me that a wanderer does not find only goods along the road, but also moments that will never fade from memory. I remember an event that happened to me on the border between the desert and the mountains. We were traveling through a narrow valley when the guides warned us. In these places, bandits often hid. They waited until a caravan stopped to rest, and then they struck suddenly. We decided to stop by a river, for the animals could barely stand from thirst. The water ran fast and cold, and everyone, myself included, grew too relaxed. We drank, washed our faces, and someone had already set a pot for supper. And that was when the shadows appeared on the cliffs. I heard a whistle, sharp, short. Then came the first stones. Bandits rained them down from above, and within moments they were upon us with crooked swords. Camels bellowed, men shouted. I felt someone tear a sack of goods right out of my hands. I seized the staff we used to drive the animals. My heart pounded so hard I could barely hear the screams. In front of me stood a boy, thin, filthy, with eyes burning with hunger. He lunged at me with a knife, but I struck his arm, and the blade fell into the grass. He staggered back, and in that instant our guards rushed forward with their sabers. A short but furious fight broke out. I remember one of our guards throwing an attacker into the river, the current sweeping him away at once. Another hurled a stone and shattered a torch the bandits meant to use to set fire to our load. We fought with whatever we had, but most of all, we held together. When it was over, several attackers lay on the ground. The rest fled into the rocks. We stood amidst chaos, torn sacks, spilled spices, wounded men. I looked down at my empty belt, where only the day before my purses of coins had hung. I had lost part of my goods, but I was alive. And in that moment, I understood life is worth more than any cargo. That night we sat around the fire, silent and drained. Then our elder caravan master spoke. A caravan is not only trade, it is a battle with the desert, with the cold, with men, and even with yourself. And whoever survives one attack is no longer the same man he was the day before. I stared into the flames and felt those words sink into me, for I knew tomorrow the road would test us again, and once more we would have to go forward. The markets along the Silk Road were the beating hearts of the cities. Wherever I arrived, whether in Bokhara, Samarkand, or Aleppo, I always went there first, for it was in the market that one could feel the true pulse of life. In Bokhara, the market began even before dawn. When the first rays of sunlight touched the walls, voices were already ringing out. People pushed their goods on wooden carts or carried them on the backs of donkeys, spreading carpets on the ground to display their wares. I saw rows filled with spices, clay jars of cinnamon, cloves, cumin, and black pepper. Walking among them, it felt as if I were moving through a wave of fragrance, swirling in the air until it made me dizzy. Beyond them stood the cloth sellers. They unrolled bolts of silk, cotton, and wool, sunlight piercing to the fabric, playing in every color. I remember how women touched the textiles with the tips of their fingers, testing not only the quality, but the warmth held in each thread. There were also the weapon stalls. They displayed swords of Damascus steel, spears, and bows. The gleam of metal was blinding. Men always gathered there, arguing over whose steel was finest, often testing the blades right there by splitting blocks of wood. Apart stood the traders of horses and camels. Shouts, whinnies, a pounding of hooves. It was the place where the fate of caravans was decided, for without animals, there was no road. I saw seasoned merchants press a hand to a horse's neck, look into its eyes before naming a price. And then there were the jewelers. Those stalls were quieter, yet more charged. Tiny boxes of turquoise, rubies, pearls, silver, and gold ornaments. Women sparkled there as brightly as the gems themselves. But the market was more than trade. It was a place of meeting. People sat in the shade, drinking tea or coffee, discussing news, speaking of the roads. You could hear everything. That in India there had been a rich harvest of pepper, that China had a new emperor, that olive oil had risen in price in Syria. Sometimes a single day spent at the bazaar could bring you more knowledge than a month of travel. I especially loved the evening hours, when the heat faded. Then the market turned into a true festival. Lamps were lit, music filled the air, stories and legends were told. I would sit in the crowd, listening to travelers speak of distant seas, and think, here lies the greatest wealth. You may walk the road for coins, but what you truly gain are the stories, the scents, the faces that stay with you forever. And now, in my old age, I often reflect. One may forget the exact price of a carpet or a horse, but it is impossible to forget how the market in Bokhara sounded at dawn, or how the spices in Aleppo smelled in the afternoon. Those sensations live longer than any trade. I walked the road for many years, and what struck me most was not the wealth of goods, but the diversity of people. In every land there was its own truth, its own customs, and a merchant who did not understand this could lose far more than he ever gained. In China, I was struck by their discipline. Officials there always inspected the goods, weighed and recorded every detail. Their markets were organized like beehives, each row for its own wares, each place assigned. Chinese merchants rarely shouted or argued. They trusted papers, seals, agreements. Silk, paper, porcelain, all that was sold almost ceremoniously, with reverence for the goods themselves. Even tea, which they drank, was not merely a beverage, but part of their culture. Tiny cups, slow sips, as though silence itself was a guest at the table. India was entirely different. Its market roared like the sea. The colors of clothing, the scents of spices, the songs of street musicians, all blended into one. There, every merchant was an actor, singing, joking, even dancing to catch your attention. I saw Indian spice traders take a pinch of turmeric or cardamom, place on your tongue and say, taste, this speaks better than words. They did not have the quiet order of the Chinese, but they had passion and the art of persuasion. Often, without realizing, I bought more than I intended, because their words and gestures convinced more powerfully than any coin. Syria was the gateway to the West. Cultures met there: Arabs, Persians, Armenians, Greeks, European travelers. In the markets of Aleppo or Damascus, one could hear dozens of languages at once. Bargaining there was fierce, often filled with shouting, arguments, even insults, but it was part of the game. Syrian merchants were shrewd. They always knew the latest news from every corner and used it to their advantage. I remember one of them, upon hearing of a poor pepper harvest in India, instantly doubled the price of his own stock. And people still bought. Persia held its own special grandeur. Its markets were not only for trade, but for art, carpets, jewelry, books, crafted with such mastery that you felt you were holding not simply goods, but a piece of the maker's soul. Persian merchants spoke slowly, often quoting proverbs or poets. Sometimes bargaining there felt more like a conversation about life than a transaction. What fascinated me was how each place had its own laws. In China, order was sacred. In India, it was the charm of words. In Syria, cleverness and wit. In Persia, reverence for beauty and craftsmanship. And I learned. To survive on the Silk Road, you needed more than to know the price of goods. You had to learn to live within another's culture, to adapt yourself to it. I learned this slowly. At times, I remained silent and signed an agreement. At others, I laughed and joked. Sometimes, I bargained until my voice was hoarse. And I always remembered, if you respect another man's customs, the road will open more doors to you than you ever imagined. Once, my road led me to Merv, the great oasis city where the routes from Persia, India, and China all converged. The market there buzzed day and night. But it was then that an event occurred which I have remembered all my life. I had brought a small but precious cargo, fine Chinese silk and several parcels of nutmeg from India. I was just laying out my goods when men in rich robes, embroidered with gold, approached me. They studied my wares in silence, then said, "The ruler wishes to see you." A chill ran through my chest. For a simple merchant, an audience with a noble could mean anything: great fortune or sudden ruin. They led me to the palace. It shone in the sunlight, walls covered with mosaics, floors draped in carpets, tables laden with pitchers of wine and plates of fruit. There sat the ruler in a silk robe, a heavy golden belt at his waist. His gaze was cold and penetrating, as if it could see straight through to your soul. "You bring goods from distant lands?" he asked. I bowed low and unrolled a bolt of silk before him. Light caught the fabric, and it shimmered as if alive. The ruler reached out, touched it, and nodded. "They say such cloth is worn only by emperors in China." "It is so, my lord," I replied, "but the journey has made this silk worthy to adorn your house as well." He was silent for a long time. Then he took several nutmegs from a tray, cracked one open, and inhaled the fragrance. His eyes softened slightly. "How much do you want for all of this?" It felt as though my heart would leap from my chest. To name too high a price was dangerous. The ruler could simply order it taken without payment. To name too low would mean losing months of toil on the road. I drew a deep breath and gave him a sum, fair but bold. He studied me for a long moment. Then he smiled, a rare, almost imperceptible smile, and said, "Good, I will take it." I felt the weight of tension lift from my shoulders. They handed me a heavy pouch filled with silver and gold. Then the ruler added, "Remember this, merchant. It is not only the goods that set a price. Sometimes it is your words and your eyes." That day I left the palace not only with a purse full of coins. I left with a lesson I carried for life. For I understood, in a world of power and splendor, survival does not depend on strength, but on honor and confidence. From that time, people in Mur began to recognize me. I heard them whisper, "That is the merchant who traded with the ruler himself." And though my road was still long ahead of me, that meeting became a sign to me. The road sees even the one who walks with small steps. Caravanserais were like small cities scattered across endless spaces. Enormous stone gates, thick walls, and within them a wide courtyard large enough to hold an entire caravan with dozens of camels. The moment we stepped through that threshold, it felt as though we entered another world. After the heat of the desert came the coolness of stone. After the silence of steppe came the noise and bustle of people. The first thing we always did was tend to the animals. That was sacred. The camels knelt, and we unloaded their burdens, wiped away sweat and dust, gave them grain and water. Only after that could we think of ourselves. The courtyard was always alive with movement. Some men unloading bales of silk, others mending saddles or sacks, someone sharpening knives or repairing weapons. A few went straight to the rooms for the night, narrow stone chambers with earthen floors, where carpets were spread to sleep. But most stayed in the courtyard, for there the fire always burned. The food was simple, yet after the road it felt like a feast. Most often we ate lamb stew with chickpeas, hot flatbread from the oven, dates or figs. On lucky days, someone brought fresh milk or even a little wine. I can still remember the taste of warm bread, steam rising as you tore it apart with your hands after a long day of dust and wind. But the most precious part of the caravanserais were the evenings. When the sun set, people gathered around the fire. Someone would take up a rhubarb or a flute, and music would begin. Merchants told their stories, how they crossed a mountain pass, how they escaped bandits, how one sold goods for triple what he paid. The conversations lasted for hours, and sometimes they were more valuable than any bargain. I recall one old storyteller from Persia. He sat by the fire, spinning his legends in such a way that even the guards, who were meant to watch the gates, came closer to listen. His voice was calm, steady, and under it even the animals resting in the courtyard seemed to fall asleep. There was a kind of magic in those nights. By day, we were just traders chasing profit. By night, we became men sharing bread, stories, and the warmth of the fire. And then the road no longer seemed so heavy. Sometimes I think of it still. The caravanserai was a school of life. It was there I learned to listen to people, to see in each one not only a merchant, but a traveler with his own fate. And it was there I came to understand that the true value of the road was not in the goods we carried, but in those evenings when you felt you were not alone. Sometimes caravanserais were the only places where we felt truly safe, behind their high walls. It seemed that the troubles of the world were left outside. The desert with its storms, the mountains with their rock falls, the bandits lurking on the roads. Inside, another life prevailed, one filled with human warmth. I remember how once we stopped at a large caravanserai not far from Bokhara. The courtyard was so crowded that camels stood almost pressed against one another, their cries and the shouts of men blending into a single roar. In the narrow rooms, 5 or 6 people slept together, and yet no one complained. For after a long journey, even the stone floor felt soft. That evening we sat by the fire with merchants from India. They had brought spices with them and prepared a dish unlike our usual stew. In their pots simmered rice with cinnamon, cloves, and cumin, and the aroma was so strong that even the most weary lifted their heads to breathe it in with delight. We exchanged food. They gave us their rice, and we offered them flatbreads and cheese from our lands. In the corner sat an old physician who traveled with caravans. He tended to cuts and wounds from the road, applying ointments made of herbs that he carried in small clay jars. People gathered around him not only for healing, but for counsel as well. On the road, a wise word could save as much as any medicine. Elsewhere, the voices of singers rose. Young men and women, traveling with pilgrims, sang songs of distant lands. Their voices echoed against the stone arches, and the firelight shimmered in their eyes. Even the stern guards, who usually slept with sword at their sides, eased their watch and listened. Evenings like these taught me what mattered most. The road was hard, but where people gathered, it became a celebration. For it was not coins or goods that kept us standing, but those brief hours when we shared bread, stories, and the warmth of fire together. Once, we stopped at a caravanserai on the outskirts of Samarkand. That evening the courtyard was unusually crowded. Several caravans had arrived at once, and it seemed as though the whole world had gathered there. Beside our camels stood Indian elephants, and not far away I saw a small group of riders from the Caucasus, leading horses praised for their endurance. I settled near the fire, just pulling out a piece of bread, when I heard a familiar name. Someone nearby had called it out in conversation, and my heart suddenly froze. It was the name of an old companion, the one with whom I had once begun my journey, but who had been lost in a desert storm. I had long believed him dead, for after that night, no one had seen him again. I rose and moved closer. By the fire sat a man in plain clothing, with a deep scar on his cheek. He was laughing, telling some tale, and I knew his voice at once. It was him. We embraced, and for a long time neither of us could speak a word. Then he told me that the storm had scattered our caravan, and nomads had found him in the sands. He lived with them for several years before returning once more to the road, now more seasoned and stronger than before. That night we sat together, recalling the past. He showed me an old knife, given to him by the tribe that had saved his life, and said, "The road always takes something from you, but sometimes it gives back. I was lost to you then, but tonight we sit together again." Around us there was laughter, music from the musicians, and the bubbling of a pot over the fire. But the two of us sat gazing into the flames, feeling that fate had granted us a rare gift, to meet once more after having already said farewell in our hearts. From that time, I knew a caravanserai was not only a shelter from the road, but a place where fate itself enjoyed bringing together those long separated by storms and years. I remember the darker days of the road, those that merchants rarely speak of. For sometimes in the cities where we arrived with hopes of trade and rest, we found not celebration, but silence and fear. These were the days when a city was seized by plague. Once, I came in the shaper. We had traveled for weeks, and the weary men of our caravan dreamed of the market, of warm bread and fresh news. But when we reached the city gates, we were not greeted by noise and trade, but by guards with grim faces. They refused to let strangers enter, saying that sickness raged within the walls. I saw small groups of people gathered outside the gates, too fearful to go further. Some tried to trade right there, beneath the walls. But even in those places, all looked at each other with suspicion. There were no handshakes, no laughter. Everyone kept their distance. Those who managed to slip inside returned with chilling tales. The streets were half empty, shops shuttered, caravanserais silent. Only bells or drums echoed at street corners, the signal that another body had been carried out from a house. I have never forgotten those accounts. How streets that only yesterday brimmed with life had become hushed and foreign. It was then that I first understood the road could bring not only gold and news, but also death. We waited for days outside the city walls, but in the end we moved on. Our goods remained unsold, and it was a loss. Yet every one of us thought less of coins and the greater treasure, our health, our very lives. After that day, I looked upon crowds with different eyes. When the market roared, when people laughed and argued, I knew it was a fragile miracle, for if sickness appeared, all that remained was silence. Now I sit in my home, far from the roads that once carried me through deserts and mountains. My hands are no longer as strong as when I held the reins of a camel in the midst of a storm. My legs can no longer endure the long marches. But memory still walks the road. I see before me the caravanserais with their high gates, the bazaars heavy with the scent of spices and smoke, the murmur of tongues I never fully learned. I recall the nights when we sat by the fire listening to old legends, and the days when the sun burned so fiercely it felt as though we were dissolving into the very air. I saw China, strict, disciplined, silent. I saw India, colorful, noisy, filled with music and laughter. I saw Syria, clever and shrewd, where men traded words as skillfully as goods. I saw Persia, majestic, where even a carpet was a poem woven from threads. And everywhere I went, I came to understand. People are different, yet all seek the same: bread, water, warmth, and a little joy. I did not become the richest among merchants. My chest holds no endless treasures. But I gained more than that. I gained the memory of a road that carried me across the world. Every step, every bargain, every danger, every meeting was part of a greater story that I carried with me. And now, in the quiet of my years, I see clearly. True treasure lies not in gold or silk, but in the people I met, in the evenings of shared laughter and tears, in the cities that opened the world before me. I lived my life upon the road. And if you ask me whether it was worth all the dangers and losses, I will say yes. For the road gave me what no coin can buy. It gave me the sense that I was part of something greater than myself. And now the night comes to my house. I sit beside the lamp, its flame flickering like the echo of old fires in caravanserais. My eyes are weary, but my heart is at peace. I have told my story, and perhaps it will find its way into your dreams, just as the road still lives on in mine. Sleep well, and remember, every road is more than steps and miles. It is a life that opens itself to those who are not afraid to walk forward.